Now, the biggest framework of genre is the concept of genre itself, and as a concept, it is reminiscent of the chicken versus the egg problem. Now, on the surface, genre would maybe seem to be the chicken, and each individual movie would seem to be an egg, and like each genre would be a chicken, and then if it was a science fiction chicken, then every egg that came from the science fiction chicken would be a science fiction egg. But that's not really how this works, and genre is not that simple to solve. So what we're going to do is explore this issue and see why genre is important, and think about how the concept of genre can help us think about classification that just makes the world simpler, or does genre ultimately make things much more complex? And so I think we'll find that a little bit of both is happening at the same time. Now, as I mentioned before, genre is a way of communicating about the things that we've experienced before. So let's take an obvious example of how this could work. If we were to talk about Western, for example, calling a film a Western is a way of communicating that a movie represents something that we've experienced before. It's based on certain characteristics, and we're going to talk about those characteristics coming up. But for now, let's just say you're a huge fan of Westerns, and one day we're talking in a bar, and I don't even use the word Western. I just say, I've seen a film called Appaloosa. And because you're a fan of Westerns, maybe you've never even heard this word Appaloosa before, but your ears pick up because the name sounds indigenous, at least a little like Native American sounding words that you've heard in other Westerns. And so already you're thinking, this must be a Western. Appaloosa is the name of a horse breed. It's not certain, but the word probably comes from Appaloosa, which is a Louisiana Indian tribal name, though the breed is traditionally associated with the Nez Perce Indians, and the Palouse River is located in the United States of Washington and Idaho. But the point is that words like Appaloosa are a signature of the Western genre, and so someone educated in that genre will immediately start creating pictures in their mind, and also emotions. And so if I were to go on to tell you that Appaloosa is kind of like Unforgiven, still not using the word Western yet, I'm helping you create even more pictures and ideas in your mind by making comparison with another specific Western. And as we continue talking, let's say we're discussing the postmodern elements now of Unforgiven, we're really sealing the deal now, because Unforgiven subverts a lot of the conventions of the Western in a way that makes you think more about its genre. So by inferring that Appaloosa is a Western and explicitly tying it to another Western that itself refers to the genre, we're using genre as a way to explain genre, right? And we're all doing it without even saying the word Western. And so part of what the concept of genre does is it helps us communicate about things that we've seen before. And this is not happening entirely at the level of concepts. It's not entirely at the level of words, and it's not entirely at the level of film titles, but it's all coming together. And so you might get pictures of cowboy hats, horses, historical settings, saloons, and all these other features common to Westerns. And because we've talked about Unforgiven as a postmodern movie, then you may get nostalgia for the past. You might get the risk of living on the frontier wilderness and dangers posed by these communities of people barely hanging on to survive in a world with undefined legal boundaries, right? So all of these things are coming together, referring to what you have experienced before. This is an interesting aspect of genre. Now, of course, it's also about emotions and feelings. And so this kind of discussion is not just about the images it creates in your head, but also the feelings. A genre makes us feel, and this is very, very important because it helps us make relationships between categories. The feeling of science fiction is a different feeling than the feeling of horror. And to stick with Western a little bit, and to touch upon horror in a certain way, there's this very hard to classify film by David Cronenberg that I'd love for you to look at. It's called A History of Violence, and it may or may not be a Western at its core. On the surface, it's a family drama with gangster elements, but at the same time, many, many reviewers pointed out that the elements of the Western are strong in this movie, and they made comparisons to High Noon, which is another Western you'll really want to see. Now, at a visual level, A History of Violence doesn't jump out as a Western. It doesn't really look like a Western. We're going to talk about what Westerns look like. But it takes place in this small town of Millbrook, Indiana, in contemporary America, but still this small town feeling. The hero wears these collared shirts, he wears jeans, and you might not notice these things in the movie until someone points them out to you. And this realization may interest you or bore you, but it can make you enjoy the movie at a deeper level just by thinking, hey, you know what, that does kind of connect to the Western. Either way, once you've come across the idea that a history of violence has some relationship to a Western, it becomes hard to get that feeling out of your mind. And so you begin to understand and classify the movie in a different way, because once you recognize this, and you can go and read more about this, and I'll suggest a resource for you, there is a strong feeling of the Western in A History of Violence, and all these critics do have a reason for why they're doing that. But the question of interest is, why? Why would they want to relate History of Violence to another movie like High Noon? Well, part of it is that it has these elements of people coming into town, bad guys that have to be chased out, and the hero chases them out, and there are these visual signatures of like the collared shirt and the jeans. But there's another answer to why that they called it a Western. And the critics have called A History of Violence a Western because they needed to feel that they understood it. And we need to feel that we understand movies. And so we might want to think about, why are there entire industries of casual, professional, and scholarly film critics out there who devote their careers to putting the name of genres on movies and discussing them in the context of genre? And the answer is really, really simple and revealing. Humans are uncomfortable with things that they can't classify. And we, as a species, tend to try to avoid the unclassifiable. In fact, it's this tendency that explains a lot of the elements of the horror genre, so stay tuned for the section on the horror genre that we'll be looking into. But for now, there's a very, very interesting resource that'll help you think about this. There's a book called The Différend by the philosopher Jean-François Lyotard, and he talks about cataloging things into genre and how it gives us a sense of finality, of being able to put things to rest. He also says that genres suppress and exclude. So for example, if you were making a drama, you might have a few laughs in the movie, but those laughs would not just be to provide comic relief from the drama, but it would be a way of reasserting the seriousness of that field. Likewise, a typical comedy would seek to suppress and exclude elements of drama overall, but it might use some very dead serious moments in order to reassert its comedic nature. Now, to take Lyotard's idea to an example like A History of Violence, it's important to note that the movie was directed by a Canadian with a long history of making subversive movies that are very difficult to classify. Cronenberg's movies generally belong to the horror genre, and he's been called the Baron of Blood and all kinds of other things because of how he's been a master in that genre. But it's also not that clear, not that cut and dried, because of so many elements that are going on. But no matter what genre Cronenberg is working in, he is always pushing his stories to a new level. And so critics respond by labeling his works in different ways, and they are trying to manage his subversive attempts. So when something came along like A History of Violence, if we were to follow Lyotard's thinking, by stressing that History of Violence belongs to the Western genre, it's not because it doesn't have these conventions. It certainly does have this Western convention of a bunch of bad guys rolling into town that have to be chased out by the good guy, and there's certain gangster elements as well. But one of the things, arguably, that they were doing was to exclude the horror elements in that film. So this is at least Bart Beatty's argument in a very interesting study of the film, which is called David Cronenberg's A History of Violence. It's a very interesting point to pursue, because so much of the classification that we may do in the work of genre is maybe motivated to protect ourselves from harm, from having to face uncomfortable truths. It sounds outrageous to think that we are harmed by not having a genre label for each and every film, but for the purposes of this course, and when you read this book, it's really important to understand that people have been thinking about genre for thousands of years, and we have to wonder why. And one reason clearly seems to be that as humans, we are motivated to make things clean and understandable. And genre categories help us do this. So I recommend reading Lyotard's Différend and Beatty's book to understand why critics have found the horror elements in A History of Violence so threatening and so strange that they focused on the Western genre instead and talked about its relationship to High Noon without acknowledging the fact that it could just as well be a horror movie or a gangster film or something that has all three. Arguably, the lack of categories in and of itself is threatening, and people will take the safest category in order to have a category. So we're going to be working and still working to settle these issues throughout this course and for thousands of years, because as you'll see in this course, people have been trying to figure out classification systems already for thousands of years. But we want to understand all of this, and so I hope that you'll follow up with a history of violence and watch High Noon and read these books, because they're very, very important in helping you understand genre as a problem. But we need to go on and move to the ultimate problem of genre, which I think you're going to find very fascinating.